This week's guest is Kit Prendergast. Kit is a native bee researcher, and she's just finished her PhD studying the interactions between native bees and European honeybees in urban areas of southwest and Western Australia. Kit is also an author and has written a book called Creating a Haven for Native Bees, as well as an e-book called A Crash Course to Australian Bee Taxonomy and Identification. Kit is also a lover of the arts and has studied and competes in gymnastics, and has also created a number of bee-related designs that she's used on t-shirts and other items. In this wonderfully informative podcast, Kit gives us so much information about native bees, like how to attract them to your garden, what makes a good bee hotel, and how to distinguish native bees from the introduced honeybee and similar-looking insects like wasps and flies. I learned so much about our native bees from my talk with Kit, and I'm sure you will as well. You'll also get to hear the 5 songs that Kit selected and her reasons for choosing them. Okay, Kit, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for wanting to talk to me about bees.
Well, it's an amazing subject. I think a lot of people have got such an affinity towards insects in general, but I'm probably butterflies and bees and dragonflies are the ones that people tend to see the most. So I wanted to get from you, what's the difference between native bees and the European honeybees that most people see?
Yeah, so there's 20,000 species of bees in the world and 2,000 species of bees in Australia. So it's hard to say, well, there's clear native bees versus honeybees in terms of differences. But honeybees are very different from pretty much the majority of native bee species. So this is also a problem when it comes to conservation or raising awareness about bee protection, because they don't represent bees as a whole. Even though all the media attention is on the European honeybee, they're actually outliers in the whole entire bee world. So the majority of our native bees are solitary. They don't live in big colonies. There are a couple of species, 11 in Australia, the 𝗲𝗏𝗎𝗍, that are colonial and live in that eusocial structure, but they're also stingless. So again, this idea of what makes a bee based on honeybees is quite misleading. Most people then start to think that all native bees are stingless, but actually the majority can sting. They just won't sting you. They're far less aggressive than honeybees. And the majority of bees actually don't make honey either. So this idea of bees are insects that make honey isn't correct. Again, it's only the eusocial bees. So in Australia, 11 out of about 2,000 species make honey, but the majority don't. They come in a huge range of colours, behaviours. So there's a huge diversity in terms of that, but most of them are unlike honeybees.
Okay, and so the European honeybee is the only one that's commercial?
Well, over on the east coast of Australia, sugar bag bees, which are those stingless or 𝗲𝗏𝗎𝗍𝗎 bees, there's a small market and it's growing. So it's a small, at the moment, market that's growing, and because they do live in colonies, they actually can be managed. And the main one is Tetragranula carbonaria. They do make honey that can be harvested, but the difference is they make only about a jar a year. So it's a very small amount. It can't sort of supply the whole entire honey market. They can also be used for pollination services of crops like the honeybee, and in particular used for macadamia pollination, as well as a couple of other crops. But yeah, the majority of bees also can't be sort of like used for commercial purposes.
Okay, and I know that European honeybees were introduced in Australia in the early 1800s, around 1820s, I think. Obviously, they've had a massive impact on our native bee populations and our ecosystems as a whole. Do they do some beneficial services?
So this is a very thorny and controversial topic, and whenever it gets raised, there's some very strong opinions on either sides by the beekeepers and then native bee conservationists. Honeybees, they are, an introduced species. They are a very successful species because they live in such big colonies. Because they live in colonies, they're able to communicate where good patches of flowers are and usurp the foraging resources that native bees need. And they're generalists, so they are less like vulnerable to land clearing and other things. So they can have beneficial outcomes, but mainly from a crop pollination perspective. Because they're generalists, because they can be managed, they will visit exotic crops, including in landscapes that are very unsuitable for native bees, which can sort of be a bad thing for native bees indirectly, because then people can go, well, we don't need to keep the large tracts of native vegetation around almonds because we can just truck in honeybees and they can do the pollination services. So even then, there's an indirect negative impact. When it comes to honeybees in natural areas, then it's unlikely that they will have a beneficial impact. They can pollinate things, but we have to think, well, other fauna were pollinating the flora before honeybees arrived. So it's not like they're filling a niche that wasn't there before. So in national parks, in places that should be reserved for conservation, beekeepers are still allowed to put essentially an introduced species in high abundances into these protected areas. It's like putting livestock into national parks. It's just not something that should be done when areas are set aside for wildlife conservation. So yeah, honeybees, they do, like, we need them for crop pollination. We need them for honey production, because the native bees would never be able to completely fulfill the role that this abundant general species can perform. But when it comes to natural areas, then it's an overall like net negative impact.
Okay. Is there anything that native bees do that European honeybees can't do as far as pollination or other ecosystem services?
Yeah, so one thing that honeybees can't do, and this is even for crop pollination, is they can't do what's called buzz pollination, where there's flowers where they will only release the pollen if they're vibrated at a particular frequency. Honeybees can't do that. Quite a few lineages of native bees can do that. One of the most effective ones are the 𝗳𝗄𝗄𝗃. So these are the 𝗳𝗄𝗃 that are sometimes called blue-banded bees, sometimes called teddy bear bees. There's over 30 species of 𝗳𝗄𝗃 in Australia, and they have been looked at for pollination even of tomatoes in greenhouses, and they're very effective. Honeybees can't do that. We've also got native Solanaceae, which require, the buzz pollination. So yeah, they can do that. And then specialized foraging relationships. So some of our native bees have co-evolved with flora, and they're ones that honeybees won't visit. They've got like specialized adaptations for handling the flowers. So yeah, there are sort of like niches that native bees fill that the honeybees don't.
Okay. How can people tell the difference between bees as compared to similar looking wasps or indeed large flies? There's a number of flies that have various spots and stripes on them.
Funnily enough, a couple of months ago in November, there was like an outbreak of syrphid flies. These are the little yellow and black flies. And because of this media attention that bees are yellow and black insects, which the majority of bees actually aren't yellow and black, it's that focus on honeybees. I got so many people saying, wow, there's so many native bees. And unfortunately, there were the syrphid flies, and native bees actually are not doing very well this season. So when it comes to flies and bees, it's actually relatively easy. Flies have one pair of wings, bees have two pairs. Their body shape is different. Flies have really big, bulgy eyes. They have short antennae that tend to come out of the middle of their forehead. So then with bees versus wasps, it's a bit more difficult. And this is because they're actually closely related. So flies are in the order Diptera. Bees and wasps are both Hymenoptera. And bees are actually a branch of wasps that evolved to exclusively feed on nectar and pollen. So from like a phylogenetic perspective, bees are wasps. So they can look very similar, especially like the Bembex wasps look quite similar to bees. Differences include for some bees, but not all bees. They have specialized pollen collecting hairs called 𝗂𝗶𝗄𝗃. And these are located at various locations on bees' bodies. It depends on the genus. But if you see an insect with big, clumps of pollen on it, it will be a female bee. If you see an insect carrying another insect as prey, it will be a wasp. So the female wasps, they feed on nectar, but their offspring feed on, Lepidoptera larvae or spiders or cockroaches. So the diet is one thing, and then they also move differently. So wasps tend to be like really like anxious, and they're always like twitching their antennae and twitching their legs. How they hold their wings, so bees hold their wings sort of like parallel at rest, whereas most wasps hold their wings in a V shape.
Okay.
And then the position of their eyes, like bees and their antennae. So bees tend to have oval eyes with antennae placed higher up on their forehead, whereas wasps tend to have kidney-shaped eyes and their antennae are placed lower down. So those are some of the morphological features.
Excellent. Oh, well, that's good. I'm sure people will be able to pick up a lot better what they're seeing in the garden. I suppose the other thing is, just for people to understand, what's the difference between nectar and honey, and how does pollen fit into that whole scheme of things?
Yeah, so honey is actually nectar that has had some water evaporated off it. So the water content has been reduced and some enzymes of the bee has been added into it. So it's only produced by the colonial eusocial bees as a surplus of nectar that they store, and then they can go feed it to their offspring. With the native bees, they collect nectar and they mix it with pollen and they provision their young that way. So then the nectar, or what we, for the eusocial bees, honey, that's providing energy, but the pollen is the key thing that provides, in particular, protein, minerals, vitamins, nutrients. That's for the developing baby bees. So the adult bees don't eat the pollen. They get the females specifically collect pollen so that their offspring have those nutrients for development.
And royal jelly is another term that gets bandied around. How does that fit into that whole equation?
Yeah, so royal jelly is only with the honeybees, and it's really interesting because it's the thing that determines whether a baby honeybee, the larvae, becomes a queen or just becomes a worker. So genetically, there is, at the level of the DNA sequence, there is no difference between a queen honeybee and a worker honeybee. The difference is how those genes are expressed. And that cascade of the genetic expression differences is that they are fed something different called royal jelly, which is a substance that the nurse bees regurgitate and feed to the larvae that are going to become queen honeybees.
Okay. So we're going to listen to your first song now, Kit. Eyes Like Yours by 𝗫𝗃𝗃. Can you tell us why you picked that song?
So I have loved 𝗫𝗃𝗃 even before she became big in Australia. My dad, he works FIFO and sometimes worked overseas when I was growing up, and he's an engineer, and he went to, it was somewhere in South America, and that's where 𝗫𝗃𝗃 is from, and she was like a very popular singer there, like all in Spanish. And so he got her CD for me, and I loved her. And then she became big in Australia, and that was great. And this song has like even special resonance for me because I'm a gymnast, and I did a gymnastics routine to this song as well. And I just love the sort of Latin vibes, and I think it's a really like cool song.
So, Kit, before the song, you gave us a great introduction into like what bees are, the native bees in Australia, what they look like, and how they differ from other small similar insect species that might be in the garden. I want to dig a little bit more down into probably the more technical aspect of your PhD research, which congratulations on, by the way. I believe it was finalised about 6 months ago. Is that right?
So my PhD, I submitted it in August, and it was passed in about a month ago. I've got a few minor revisions to do, but the feedback from the examiners was very positive, and yeah, passed. One of them recommended it should be commended, so that was really great. Yeah, on the way to being a doctor.
Fantastic. It must be a great relief. So your PhD interactions between native bees and introduced honeybees in urban areas. Can you tell us what in a simple summary view, what that means?
Yeah, so it was a massive project, and I ended up branching out into looking at many other things, but I was primarily interested, I guess, with three main strands, all looking at native bees and their interactions with plants and honeybees in the urbanised region of the southwest Western Australian biodiversity hotspot. So in Perth, which is the capital city of WA, we're actually located in a globally recognised biodiversity hotspot, which makes it a really interesting place to do research because it's an urban area, but it's also in a place that is known to have high biodiversity, mainly in terms of the plants. So I was looking at how habitat types in terms of people's gardens versus patches that remnant bushland support native bees, and looking at the flowers they visit and the networks of those interactions, and then how honeybees influence these interactions and the native bees themselves.
Okay, and from that you published a paper which is quite self-explanatory, really. It's residential gardens are a poor substitute for native bushland.
Yeah. So the native vegetation that remains in urban areas, it's just so important for native bees. We can't replicate that with gardens. But what you do in your garden can make a difference, but it can't replace the native vegetation because that's a whole ecosystem there. And unless you have everyone in the street planting the right plants, which are native plants, on the verges, connecting it all up, you don't have that connectivity. And so many people plant exotic flowers, which is just inappropriate for many of our native bees that have co-evolved for the Australian flora over thousands of years, and they just can't survive on the exotic plants. So if this sort of ideal of a garden taken from, I guess, Europe as being full of a high diversity of like tulips and petunias and marigolds and pansies, that's like a desert to our native bees.
Okay, so is it simply a case of people need to have more species complex in their gardens, or is it they have to have more things that are native to their specific area?
Yeah, so it's more about the particular plants. So you don't need to get bogged down about having ones that are local to your local area. It can be good so that like they're better adapted to the soil, so it's less effort. But the 𝗵𝗽cie, like the gum trees, eucalypts, they're like the key ones that will attract so many native bees. Yesterday, I went for a jog, and I'm in like a very suburbia, and there were some like eucalypts. I don't think they're even native to like Western Australia, but there were literally hundreds of little specialist native bees visiting it that can only forage on eucalypts. So yeah, it's making sure that you've got, like, definitely have a eucalypt or a melaleuca, leptosperm. Those 𝗵𝗽cie are really important. The native pea plants are great ones as well. And then, yeah, it's the species composition, as well as the nativeness. And as I said, like, local to your area is probably best, in terms of the overall environment, but for supporting native bees, native Australians. And despite that, like, people still tend to just go for like exotic plants.
Hmm.
And I feel like it's really weird because not only is it more hard work, like I'm not a gardener. It's so funny. Like I love native bees. I'm all about making sure you have good gardens for native bees, but I am not a gardener. I cannot look after plants. So native plants are actually lots of them in Western Australia. We live in what's called an old climatically buffered infertile landscape. So the soil is terrible. It's basically sand. And if you want to grow like exotic plants, you just have to put fertilizer in and water them heaps. The native plants are better adapted to those soils, and they actually get killed if you put too much like phosphate fertilizer in.
So it makes sense to go native. Is it a matter of a range of different plant types? So should we have ground covers, shrubs, trees, to cater for bees that might be in different layers?
So that is like a question that I would love to look at, and I put a grant in to look at it, but apparently that's not interesting enough. But I think, in terms of, I guess, like economic value, but I think it's super interesting ecologically to look at the foraging preference heights of native bees. But just based on my observations, I do find that some bees prefer to forage close to the ground on sort of like ground substrates, then other ones higher up. And from, again, like a whole ecosystem perspective, having a range of substrate heights is good because you can have like the birds and then the lizards on the ground. So yeah, I would definitely try and create that structural complexity as well.
Yeah, cool. And I was thinking exactly the same thing. It's sort of like we do it for birds, we do it for maybe reptiles and frogs and things like that. We cater to their different preferences for maybe nesting, ground foraging, protective cover, and things like that. Would the same plants cater for like nectar feeding birds and bees?
No, not usually. So quite a few plants have actually evolved to deter birds so that bees come, or deter bees so that birds visit them. So there are some plants that are visited by birds and bees. So like, again, the eucalypts, they'll be visited by parrots and bees and wasps and flies. But then there are other plants that are adapted to bird pollination. So they will have very long corollas or tubes so that only the long bird bill can get into it, and the nectar often is a different concentration to cater to the higher like energy needs of birds. And there's been like studies looking at kangaroo paws actually, which are bird pollinated, and native bees, because they're specialized, they won't go to the kangaroo paws, but honeybees will, and they found that the honeybee visitation actually is negative to the kangaroo paw because the honeybees don't forage as far. So yeah, and then you've got like flowers that the birds just won't go for because they're too small, and they're just the nectar isn't the right concentration or composition. There are some, as I said, some flowers like bottlebrush as well as one that's visited by parrots and bees. Yeah, there's a huge diversity, but if you just plant for birds, you're unlikely to be able to cater to all the foraging needs of native bees.
Okay, and I know you've written a book on this, and we'll probably chat about that a little bit later. But I know if I go to a nursery or a hardware store that sells plants, they're great at putting those tags out there that say bird attracting. Should we be having bee attracting tags on our plants as well?
Yeah, I think we definitely should. And unfortunately, there are like things that are called pollinator mixes or bee mixes that are sold by Mr. Fothergill's. And I think there's like 13 plants in there, and 11 of them are exotic plants which aren't visited by bees, and I'm pretty sure like 2 of them aren't even visited by honeybees. So they've just been like, okay, cool, these look like they probably visited by bees. And yeah, it gets me really angry that there's quite a few of us that are putting ourselves out there on social media. Social media is not my favorite thing to do. I don't get paid for it, but like we're readily available to advise on these, and then yeah, they just like swindle people's money with detriments to the wider environment, which is not very
A little bit more greenwashing sort of thing.
good.
You spoke before about, I mean, a little bit more on the habitat fragmentation and urbanisation, but how far does a bee fly when it's typically foraging? What's a home range?
So it depends on the bee species, and it varies with body size. So some of our native bees are just 2 millimeters long, and most of these are the specialist bees. So they probably can't fly more than 50 meters, and that would be a big flight for that little bee. And I've been doing some studies on a critically endangered plant that's visited by bees, and it's separated by probably a kilometre, and it's showing inbreeding, which suggests that the bees aren't moving between the plants. So yeah, native bees, the small ones would have very small foraging ranges. The only bees that have been in Australia who've like explicitly been measured, their flight distance is 𝗳𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃. So this is a eusocial bee. They tend to forage about 250 meters, and obviously the closer the plants are to the nesting resource, the less energy the bees have to use to go and find resources. So fragmentation is not a good thing for native bees.
Okay, and probably begs the next question is, if like I wanted to start attracting the eusocial bees to my garden, where are they going to come from? Can we bring them in, from a local breeder, or will they arrive given enough people doing the right thing?
So the solitary bees, they will be, they will arrive from the bushland patches, and they can even establish in your garden or around your garden if there's sufficient resources. So I've actually just got a paper that's been accepted for publication on a bee, 𝗬𝗏𝗄𝗃 plumosus, and I recorded its nesting habits in people's gardens. So it's a ground nesting bee, and it's been nesting in their gardens, which suggests that they've established in that area. With the eusocial Meliponene bees on the East Coast, you can actually buy a colony and put it in your yard, so they don't need to travel there. You can actually keep one and essentially keep them as pets.
The other thing I was going to talk about is bee hotels. What is the essential requirements of a bee hotel? I've seen lots of different ones in different stores and in the local botanic gardens with a variety of hole sizes. Can you give people an idea of what they should be doing as far as a bee hotel is concerned?
Yeah, so bee hotels have become super popular lately, which is good and bad, because correctly designed, they can be great. They will encourage bees to your garden. They will create extra nesting resources for the native bees. But lots of like hardware stores are getting on the bee bandwagon and selling bee hotels that are designed very poorly and will either not attract bees, or if they do, can do harm. So I've seen ones with holes with splinters in them. So if a bee goes into it, its wings will be ripped. I've seen ones with the diameter and the length are really important. So if the diameter is more than about 1 centimeter, it's probably too big for the native bees. If the length is, ideally it should be at least 10 centimeters. If it's shorter, it can run the risk of skewing the sex ratio, or having all the bees subject to parasitoid wasps. And also, like, not so much the ones that are sold, but sort of companies putting out massive bee hotels. But this isn't what occurs in nature. And if there's disease, the disease will just spread through a very large population. So what companies don't even seem to recognize is bee hotels, they are replicating nesting resources in nature that occur in woody trees, where holes created by wood-boring beetles are used by about 30% of native bees to use as nesting resources. So we're trying to replicate that with the bee hotels, and they can work, and you can have lots of native bees nesting in these, which is a great thing. But yeah, getting the diameter correct and the length is important.
Okay, and there's more information in your book about that?
Yeah, more information about that, what makes a good bee hotel, what makes a bad bee hotel, the species that will use it, as well as a big list of the best plants for the native bees.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to listen to your second song now, which is Love Not War by Jason Derulo. What made you pick this song?
So I love songs by Jason Derulo. Like, they're just something that whenever I hear, I want to dance to. And this song was released fairly recently, and I feel like it's a really positive one, and just like a really happy, feel-good song that we all need in these sort of like times.
Okay, so you were born in Tasmania, but you live in WA. How long you been in WA, Kit?
Well, I first came to WA when I was in year one, so I think that's 5 or 6 years old. My dad's work. I was born in Tasmania, then we went to Melbourne, then Wollongong in New South Wales, and then WA. We were here a couple of years, and then moved to Brisbane again for dad's work, and then moved back to WA for dad's work. And I've been in WA since, but I went back to Tasmania in, I was about to say last year, but it's now the year before, in October, after not being back for over a decade, to do some work, some bee work. And it was great because I got to see my family again. And my paper was just recently published on the work I was doing.
Yeah, it was it the Tasmanian apple orchards?
Yeah, that was, so I did, it was part of a global project looking at visitors to apple orchards across different climatic regions. This paper is just based solely on the research I did there. So I did sort of an extra project where, although my main focus was recording bees to the apple blossoms, honeybees, bumblebees, Bombus terrestris, which is an introduced species in Tasmania, as well as the native bees. But then I wanted to go a step further, and I was like, are the native bees visiting the native flora or the weeds around the apple orchards? And that definitely was the case. And I found that because apple is an introduced species, the majority of visits were by honeybees and then by the bumblebees, but I recorded quite a few native bees around the orchards, especially on the native vegetation, so reinforcing that importance of native vegetation. But also on the last orchard I surveyed, it was an integrated pest management one, and the other ones were organic, and it didn't have much native vegetation, which was really bad. But because it was integrated pest management, it had lots of weeds in the undergrowth, and hardly any native bees were visiting the apple blossoms, but they were loving the weeds. So reinforcing that importance of other flowers in and around orchards.
Yeah. I think you recorded something like 26 species in total there.
Yeah.
But was it 95% of the pollination of the apple trees were done by introduced species?
Yeah. And doing that research was so important because Tasmania is so understudied when it comes to native bees. So it was like this massive opportunity, and I'd love to go back there because I was only there in October. The sort of peak bee season is a bit later, especially in Tasmania, because bees like it when it's warm. And Tassie's so erratic in the weather, like it'll go from like 27 degrees one day to like 10 degrees the next day. So it was only the tip of the iceberg of the native bees that are there. So really exciting to do research in such an understudied area, and beautiful area as well.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful state. Okay, Australia is prone to long dry spells, and I've seen honeybees drink. Do native bees drink, or do they get enough moisture from like other sources?
Yeah, so native bees very, very rarely drink. They mainly get the moisture they need from nectar because nectar is quite watery. There have been only a handful of observations of native bees drinking, and they occur in places where there are no like freestanding water to suggest that it's not a requirement for them. Yeah, the honeybees definitely need water because they use it as well to regulate the temperature of their hive, so they evaporatively cool their hive.
Okay.
So it will mainly be benefiting honeybees.
Okay, so there's a lot of press around the potential catastrophic effects of loss of bees on the entire environment. Is it as bad as they say?
So losing honeybees from the environment would be bad for crop pollination. It would not really do anything for, no catastrophic loss of wild flora, probably benefit for the native bees. So that's like the world isn't gonna, like, the whole entire ecosystem won't collapse if honeybees go extinct. But the thing is, they're not going to.
Yeah.
They are one of the last species in the world that will go extinct. Native bees, though, one of the worst things is that we don't know how many of them are doing. So I just spent 3 hours this morning in a Zoom meeting looking to put native bees on the IUCN list based on where they occur and how that overlaps with the 2020 bushfires. And that's just looking at records. Some of them haven't even been collected since like the 80s. And we have no sort of like population numbers. Some are known from for specimens. It's not a very good outlook. The lack of data some of them we don't even know what plants they forage on, so we can't even begin to restore habitat for them if we don't know what plants they're foraging on. So it's a really concerning situation. And I put in 3 grants to look at how the native bees have been affected by fires in Western Australia, because all the attention's over the east, and I know that the fires were catastrophic there, but we've also had fires in Western Australia and in Tasmania, and funding bodies just aren't interested in knowing how native bees are impacted. There's been money going into honeybees, an invasive species that have been impacted, and this is when we don't want to be increasing the abundance of an introduced species. And I've been putting in grants to put up bee hotels in fire affected areas, and it's actually really, really depressing. It's great that so many people are getting interested in native bees and the word's getting out there, and I love my job so much that I can't imagine a better job. But there's also this, I guess, for anyone working on poorly studied, underappreciated species that are at conservation risk, the lack of data and the lack of funding is very, very depressing.
Yeah, exactly. And how can governments and other sort of like CSIRO and other science-based organisations, what can they do more to make bees a bit more mainstream for people to get that attention and potential funding?
I don't think the issue is bees not being mainstream. Now, over the last 5 years, they've become very increasingly popular among the public. It's the funding, especially into the taxonomy and descriptions. Most people firstly think that we know all the bees, which we don't, and that you can just go out, collect a bee, know what it is, or even worse, they think that you don't need to collect bees. You can just go look at a bee and be like, yeah, it's that. It requires years of looking at bees, understanding the traits, learning how to collect them, how to identify them. Then once you think you have a species that might be undescribed, and there's so many that are undescribed, putting into a phylogenetic framework, it's a massive undertaking. And with so many species, it's almost overwhelming. But there is a project that we've been putting together, lots of taxonomists. Again, it needs funding. There is a fund set up through 𝗻𝗡 Foundation called Discover Bees, and the aim is to get enough funding to go out and collect, especially in poorly studied regions, and using genetic technologies and pushing forward with discovering, describing species, so we can get a handle of where they are, how many there are, and which bees need some dedicated conservation attention.
What do you attribute that rise in interest in native? Is it because more publications are getting out there, or is it a social media thing that groups have been set up on Facebook or whatever that people are gravitating towards and learning more themselves?
I think because I didn't really know about native bees until I came up with my PhD project. And then not long after I came up with my PhD project, I set up a Facebook group called Bees in the Burbs. And I've been very, very dedicated to raising awareness about native bees. And I have seen such a growing interest. The group has now 9.5 thousand members all across Australia as well as internationally. And, people asking me to give talks about native bees because I didn't come from studying native bees. It's hard to make a comparison. I studied horses before this and just like wildlife in general. But I definitely feel like there has been a massive increase, and I would like to think that I helped raise that awareness because now I'm in my native bee bubble, but I
Yeah.
just see native bees everywhere now, and before I don't think they were very much under the radar.
Okay, we're going to listen to your third song now, which is Contact by 𝗏𝗏. Why did you pick this one, Kit?
This is like a random one that on Spotify, a friend, he was playing it and I sort of like spied it and played it, and I was like, I really like this song.
Okay, Kit. So earlier on, you were chatting about the size range in bees. So some are like not quite 2 millimeters in length, and the larger ones can be almost, was it 24, 25 mil? I know you did a fair bit of work on one of the larger ones, which was the Dawson's burrowing bee. Is that your favourite bee? Is that something you're drawn to?
It's hard to choose a favorite bee, but it's definitely one of my favorites, and I'm actually hoping to get a tattoo of it next week. So
Okay.
yeah, so 𝗂𝗑𝗏𝗄𝗃 is one of our biggest bees, and it's probably the first native bee I sort of became aware of when I was in, it's either like one of my last years in undergrad or in my honours year, and we were looking at sexual selection and alternative mating strategies. And Dawson's burrowing bee is interesting because there's two morphs of the male. There's the major males and minor males, and the major males are bigger, minor males are smaller, and they've got different mating tactics. So the major males, they wait on the nesting grounds for virgin females to emerge, and they battle it out. They will like fight to the death
Wow.
to get to mate with a newly emerged female. The smaller males, they have like no chance of winning a fight. So they will wait on flowering plants for females that don't get mated, and then mate with her when she goes to the flowers. So that they have like really interesting biology, and they're like really big and look amazing. And they nest in aggregations on clay pans, so like thousands of bees all together. And I'd always wanted to see these bees. They only occur around Gascoyne-Carnarvon area in Midwest Western Australia, and they're only active for like 2 months a year. And an amazing native bee scientist from Arizona, who's like written books and like really cool papers, was coming to Western Australia to study them. And one of his colleagues put him in touch with me because I'm like the WA bee girl, to like see what the weather might be like. So, he's coming all the way from Arizona. He doesn't want to be like time his visit wrong.
Yeah.
And he was only here for 2 weeks. So I was like, looking up when the bees had been recorded, what the weather would be like, the locations, and I was like, oh, this would be such a missed opportunity if I didn't go up as well. So sort of like 2 weeks before he was going to arrive, I was like, oh, I'm going to just like plan a road trip. And so I drove up to Carnarvon and found nesting aggregations with him, and for 5 days did some research. We were like recording the bees mating and what they were foraging on. It was a really like amazing experience.
Going back to honeybees again, obviously there's a lot of press on colony collapse disorder and the impacts of the Varroa destructor mite. Would that might impact on native bees?
Fortunately, no. So it's, with most parasite host relationships, they're quite specialized, because it's like an evolutionary arms race where each species has mutations that allow it to sort of outdo the parasite or the host, and then beneficial mutations will allow the host or the parasite to keep up. So it doesn't appear that the mite can harm native bees, especially not the solitary ones, but there are some other diseases of honeybees that can be transmitted from honeybees to native bees, not even by contact, but when they found that when they go to forage on flowers, they will shed bee viruses, and then when a native bee goes to forage on that flower afterwards, they will pick up the viruses. Some of the viruses are specific to honeybees, other ones are able to be transmitted, same with various other like pathogenic organisms. So there is a potential for disease transmission, but varroa won't wipe out the native bees.
Okay, I'm going to listen to your fourth song now, which is an old classic, What's Love Got to Do with It, but a remake on it by Kygo with Tina Turner. Can you tell us about this one?
Yeah, so my mum liked the original, and I love this remix. So this one I feel has, like, Tina Turner already is like very powerful in her songs and her voice, and then Kygo remixed it, and it's just got this like really upbeat, powerful vibe to it.
Okay, earlier on we touched on the book that you released, which is creating a haven for native bees. I'm interested in what people can do in their gardens. Does the book cover like a generalist approach, or is it more specific to, say, WA or a certain type of environment?
Yeah, it's general. So the book's been through a number of revisions. When I first wrote the book, it was for WA, and it's now been updated to include the whole of Australia. I've got sort of profiles for species that use bee hotels, and it says where they occur, so you can check whether they occur in your area. And then the list, I've got a big list of flowers, and the important thing is to look at the genus. So many genera occur across Australia, and they will cater to those native bees. And then there's general recommendations for how you can help native bees as well, in terms of habitat management, combating climate change, and actions to do that, and general information about like the biology of the native bees. So yeah, it's Australia wide, and I've even had, like, because the information on what makes a good bee hotel is applicable to cavity nesting bees across the world. So I've even had people in Canada purchase my book, and the US, and it was featured on a US bee blog. So yeah, it's now gone global.
Fantastic! Oh, that's great. And where can people get a copy of this? Is it available at bookstores, or is it through yourself?
Through myself. So unfortunately, I've sold out of the hard copies. I've now, like, I think I've printed by now like over 600 books, and they've all sold. I am planning on doing another print batch next year, but at the moment, never fear, it's still available as an online ebook, and that's available just by emailing me. My email address is kitprendergast21@gmail.com. So that's how you can get a hold of it.
Does it go into species identification at all, or genus identification?
So it lists some genera and bees and some general characteristics, but then I have another online ebook called A Crash Course in Native Bee Taxonomy, and that goes into depth of how to ID bees, the genera, also how to ID them from wasps and flies, and the diagnostic details, and that sort of. I wasn't planning on creating that ebook, but I did a course for people on how to ID bees, and then after the course, people like, we would love this as like an ebook, and so yeah, it's now available.
Excellent. Oh, fantastic. Also, is something related to bees, but also a different area. You've got a bit of a passion for clothing design. When I look at some of your posts on LinkedIn and things like that, I'm always I love looking at the different outfits you're wearing and things like that. But do you design all those yourselves? Have you got a passion for clothing design?
Yeah, so I love art as well. So I've got, science is my first love, but I also have a passion for the arts, visual arts, performing arts, especially performing arts. And I I also have a passion for destroying misinformation. And so when you're on Facebook, like, if they have targeted ads, and I kept seeing this plant bees save the bees like murals, and they had flowers for bees. I was like, they're the wrong flowers for Australian bees. So I then designed a mural with, I drew some of the best flowers for native bees and some little native bees, and created that mural and said, plant these, save the native bees. So, and then I created a Redbubble store, the 𝗵𝗵𝗴𝗃, and I've now done quite a few other designs of various native bee species to raise the profile of native bees. Like Redbubble has like not just t-shirts, but like if you want a mug with native bees on them, you can do that, like even a bath mat. Yeah.
Fantastic. And Costa off the ABC Gardening Show wore one of your t-shirts.
Yeah, so he's got 2 of my t-shirts and he's worn them quite a fair bit. I think he even wore them on like his Christmas Day segment. So I'm really pleased with that. And Costa is like such a great public speaker and advocate for, you know, good gardens. So that was really great. I've actually featured on Gardening Australia, but not with Costa because he's over on the East Coast. But I did a little segment for Gardening Australia at Kings Park here, which was really fun.
Oh, awesome. Okay, we're going to listen to your last song, which is Far Away From Home by Sam Feldt. What made you choose this one?
I think it's such a beautiful song. And like whenever I'm like driving and it comes on, I turn it up. Sort of first heard it, I guess, during like sort of COVID times. And I thought it was like really resonated me, like even when people are far away from each other and they can't like be together and connect, you know, they're still, you know, in your heart, I guess.
So, Kid, what research projects you're working on now? What's next for you?
At the moment, I'm not technically employed, which is bad, but I seem to be working on more things than ever. In terms of like actual paid work that I'm doing some surveys for Department of Biodiversity Conservation and Attractions. I'm surveying some reserves in the Jarrah Forest area. I've also was previously doing some surveys for them at a reserve to find a threatened bee, and I couldn't find it. I found lots of other bees, but yeah, this is the case. Like it hadn't been recorded for over a decade. The outlook is not very good for it, unfortunately. But from those surveys, I've also got lots of bees that I need to curate an ID. So I've got a massive backlog in IDs to do. I'm working on getting bees listed on the IUCN Red List and hopefully the 𝗵𝗃𝗃 Act so that they have some legislation. I'm working on a review on looking at studies on the impact of fire on bees. And this is now the non-paid work, and I'm also editing another review with a postdoc student over east, looking at threats to native bees. I was helping her with a paper that she did on bee behaviour. I'm working on getting one of my papers from my PhD published. I've got some other half-finished papers that didn't make it into my thesis that I would be devastated if they never saw the light of day. So I was looking at bee hotels, pollen analysis of native bees, and some caged experiments. And I'm sure I've forgotten some other things. There's so many. And the last 2 weeks I've been doing fringe performances as well. That's non-bee related. Yeah.
Wow, that's a massive list. Yeah, definitely. You wouldn't. Yeah, I don't know how you have time to stop and talk to people like me. But no, it's been absolutely fantastic. I've learned so much, and hopefully the people listening have learned so much about our native bees and related fauna. And I really hope that a lot of people jump on and download your ebook and start setting up their gardens and their local areas to be more native bee friendly.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
And your research is, just incredible. It's people like you that really make a massive difference. So I'm thankful that you took the time to chat to us about it.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate your interest in the native bees and getting the word out there. Getting the word out there. Getting the word out there.